The first time I ever laid eyes on Shane Hill, he was throwing a man twice my size across a parking lot, like the guy weighed nothing more than a bag of groceries. I had just stepped out of the clinic where I worked, badge still clipped to my chest, stethoscope looped around my neck, a half-eaten granola bar in my hand. The evening air was cool and smelled like pine resin from the trees at the edge of the lot. I was thinking about nothing more dramatic than whether I had enough eggs at home to make an omelet when I heard the scuffle. 3 men. One of them pinned against a pickup truck, fear carved into every line of his face. 2 others closing in with the lazy confidence of people who had done this before and suffered no consequences for it. And then a 4th figure stepping from between 2 parked cars, unhurried, broad-shouldered, moving like gravity itself was on his side. Shane did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply appeared in the space between the aggressor and the victim, and something in the air changed. I felt it from 20 feet away, a shift in pressure, a drop in temperature. The 2 aggressors hesitated, which was already remarkable, and then Shane said something so low I could not hear it, and the bigger of the 2 lunged at him. What followed was efficient, almost quiet. 3 moves, maybe 4, and the big man was down on the asphalt, and his companion was backing away so fast he nearly tripped over his own feet. The man who had been pinned against the truck stood frozen, mouth open, like he could not fully process what had just happened. Shane turned to him, said something that made the man nod twice and then hurry away, fumbling for his keys. Then Shane turned, and for a single unguarded moment before he arranged his expression into something neutral, I saw the look on his face. Not triumph, not aggression, something closer to exhaustion, something that said, I am so tired of always being the one who has to do this. Our eyes met across the parking lot. His were gray, not the cold gray of wet slate, but the warmer gray of winter morning sky just before the sun decides to come up. He was tall, taller than me, which was not difficult since I barely cleared 5'10", and he had the kind of build that came from use rather than vanity, from actual physical labor rather than an hour on the cable machine 3 times a week. His jaw was square and shadowed with several days of stubble. His hair was dark brown and needed a cut. He was wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and the knuckles of his right hand were slightly reddened. He looked at me with those gray eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked down at his hand, turned it over once, turned it back, and walked away. I stood in the parking lot holding my granola bar until the sound of his boots on the asphalt faded. That night, I burned my omelet because I could not stop thinking about the exhausted look on his face. My name is Bill Ray, and I am an Omega who has spent the better part of 32 years trying not to make a big deal out of that fact. This is not always an easy position to maintain when you work in a clinic in a mid-sized town where the pack dynamics still run through everything like fault lines under the ground. The town is called Harrow Creek, which sounds more dramatic than it is. It is mostly hills, mostly trees, a main street with a hardware store and 2 coffee shops and a diner that everyone agrees has the best biscuits in a 50-mile radius, and a clinic where I see 12 to 16 patients a day and try to keep the older alphas from ignoring their blood pressure medication. I moved here 18 months ago from a city 300 miles east, following a job and, quietly, following a need for something I could not name precisely. The city had started to feel like a place I was performing my life in rather than living it. Every morning I woke up in my apartment with its view of a parking garage, and I would think, this is fine. And then I would feel the specific grief of a person who knows that fine is not the same as good. Harrow Creek was supposed to be an experiment, a 2-year contract with the clinic, a rented house with an actual yard where nothing lived yet but hope and dead leaves, and then I would reassess. That was the plan. The plan did not account for Shane Hill. I saw him again 4 days later, in the line at the coffee shop on Maple Avenue. I was behind him. He was ordering a black coffee, large, no exceptions. I could hear him from 3 people back because his voice carried, not loud, just deep in a way that resonated, the kind of voice that moves through a room rather than across it. The barista, a A young beta woman named Cora, who I knew from the clinic, was giving him a very specific kind of smile that said she was hoping for a different kind of transaction than commerce. He took his coffee, paid, and turned to wait at the end of the counter and found me standing 3 feet away because I had moved forward in line. Up close, the gray eyes were even more disconcerting. They were attentive in an unusual way. Not predatory. I had been around enough predatory alphas to know the difference, but watchful. Like someone who had learned very early that paying close attention to the world was the difference between safety and disaster. "You were in the parking lot," he said. Statement, not question. He had clocked me in those 3 seconds better than I had given him credit for. Dr. Bill Ray. I shifted my coffee cup to my left hand and offered my right. "I work at the Harrow Creek Clinic." He looked at my hand for a moment, not rudely, more like he was making a decision, and then shook it. His grip was firm and warm, and he released me after exactly as long as was appropriate, which I noticed because too many alphas held on a beat too long just to make a point. Shane Hill. He picked up his coffee. "You gonna report what you saw?" "There's nothing to report. I saw 3 men, 2 of whom left voluntarily and 1 of whom appeared to have tripped and scraped his hand." I looked at him evenly. Did he need medical attention? Something shifted around his eyes. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. He was fine. "Then neither of us has anything to talk about." He studied me for another moment. Then he nodded, slow and deliberate, and walked out of the coffee shop. Through the window, I watched him cross the street toward a truck, the same dark green pickup that had been in the clinic lot the other night, and drive away. Cora appeared at my shoulder. "You know Shane Hill?" "I don't know him. We've been in the same parking lot." "He's the alpha of the Hill Pack. They're old family here. Been in Harrow Creek longer than the town has." She handed me my latte. "Keeps to himself mostly. Not unfriendly, just contained, like he's got walls you'd need scaffolding to get over." I thought about the exhausted look I had caught on his face before he knew I was watching. "Walls like that," I said, mostly to myself, "usually have a door somewhere." The clinic in Harrow Creek served both the town and the surrounding pack territories, which in practice meant that some of my patients were people who drove 40 minutes on gravel roads to see me, and some of them were people who would rather have driven 40 minutes on gravel roads than admit they needed a doctor. Alphas, mostly, in the second category. This is a universal truth that transcends pack politics. Alphas are terrible patients. Shane Hill was the exception that proved the rule, and I learned this not from him but from my nurse Marcus. A cheerful beta in his 40s who knew everything about everyone in Harrow Creek and distributed this information with the particular satisfaction of a person who has cultivated a rare garden. Shane Hill brings all his pack members in for annual checkups, Marcus told me on my 4th week at the clinic while we were between patients. Every single one of them. Sets the appointments himself, drives the ones who don't have transport, shows up with a list of questions. A list. Printed. Color-coded, sometimes. Marcus looked at me over his reading glasses. The man is not what you expect. I was learning that. Over the next 6 weeks, I encountered Shane Hill in the coffee shop twice more. Brief exchanges. The kind where we learn small things about each other in the inefficient conversational way. Like uncovering a mosaic 1 tile at a time. He took his coffee black because he genuinely liked the bitterness of it, not as a performance of toughness. He was reading a book on sustainable forestry management. He drove the old green pickup because it had been his father's, and even though it burned oil and the heater worked only intermittently, he was not ready to sell it. He did not say this last part. I inferred it from the way he talked around the truck, the small protective energy in his voice when he mentioned getting it serviced. He learned that I drank lattes because I liked the ritual of ordering something warm and slightly complicated. That I had moved from the city not because of anything dramatic, but because of the accumulated weight of 1,000 ordinary days that had begun to feel like someone else's life. That I ran in the mornings, on the trail that skirted the east edge of town, and that I was very bad at taking my own advice about rest. None of these conversations lasted more than 10 minutes, but they had a quality to them that I could not exactly name, a texture, like the grain in good wood, that suggested something more substantial underneath. Then, on a Wednesday morning in early November, Shane Hill walked into my clinic as a patient. Marcus brought me the chart with an expression that very carefully said nothing at all. I looked at it. Shane Hill, 35, Alpha. Reason for visit, general checkup, overdue. I straightened my coat, reminded myself that I was a professional, and walked into examination room 2. He was sitting on the paper-covered table in the way that large, self-possessed men always sat on examination tables. Like the table was the uncomfortable one in this situation, not him. He had his hands on his knees, and he was looking at the anatomy poster on the wall with the focused attention of a man who would rather look at anything than the door. When I came in, he looked at me and I saw a flicker of something, relief, surprise, that he schooled very quickly into his usual composed expression. "I didn't know you were the doctor here," he said. "There are 3 of us. I could arrange for you to see Dr. Okafor instead, if you prefer." A beat. "No, this is fine. This is fine." The specific phrase of a person trying to understate their feelings. I sat down across from him, opened the chart, and became Dr. Ray. This was a mode I had learned to slide into like a second skin. Not cold exactly, but focused, professionally kind. The part of me that noticed the particular gray of his eyes and the way he carried tension in his shoulders, the same way I carried it in my jaw. That part I set aside. Neatly, quietly, like folding a letter and putting it in a drawer. "When was your last checkup?" 3 years ago. "Blood work?" "Same." "Okay." I made notes. "Any concerns you want to address today, or is this strictly maintenance?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Headaches. Been getting them in the afternoon mostly, last couple months. Location, front, back, sides, behind the eyes. Like pressure. Frequency? 3, 4 times a week." I nodded, kept writing. "Are you sleeping?" Another pause, longer this time. I glanced up. He was looking at me directly, which he had been doing since I sat down, but it felt different now, like a weight had shifted. "Define sleeping," he said. "More than 4 hours, less than 8, uninterrupted, in a bed." "Then no." "For how long?" "Long time. Long time." I set down my pen, not making a big moment of it, just setting it down so that I could give him my full attention without the barrier of the chart between us. "What gets in the way?" He looked at the anatomy poster again. "Responsibility. That's a broad category. It's a broad problem." I had heard this before, in various forms, from the alphas who took their roles seriously. The weight of being the one who was supposed to hold everything together. The pack, the territory, the people who depended on them. It was a real weight. Some of them wore it well, like a harness they had grown into. Others were being slowly crushed by it, and they would not say so because saying so felt like failing. Shane Hill, I thought, was somewhere in between. Strong enough to carry it, self-aware enough to know it was costing him something, stubborn enough not to put it down. "The headaches are almost certainly tension and sleep deprivation," I said. "We'll do blood work to rule out anything else, but I'd bet on lifestyle first. The fix is less complicated than you'd like it to be." "Less complicated? Meaning what?" "Sleep. Consistent schedule. Reducing the number of hours you spend carrying other people's problems in the muscles of your neck." The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile again. "You prescribing delegation?" "I'm prescribing approximately 8 hours of unconsciousness per night and a slightly reduced savior complex." I picked up the pen again. "I'll also recommend magnesium before bed for the tension. We can check in a month and see if the headaches have improved." He was quiet while I finished the notes. Then, as he was rolling his sleeve back down after the blood draw, "The parking lot." I looked up. "I wasn't going to tell you this," he said, "but I noticed you before that, week before. You were running on the East Trail early morning, around 6. I thought back. "You run the East Trail?" "My property backs up against it." He fastened his cuff button. "I saw you stop to help a woman whose dog had gotten its leash tangled in a branch. Spent about 10 minutes on it. You were going to be late, but you stopped anyway. I remembered the dog. a large, ungainly golden retriever who had managed to wind his leash around a low branch in a way that defied easy description. The woman had been flustered, and the dog had been enthusiastic about being stuck. I had been late to the clinic, yes. Why are you telling me this? My voice came out quieter than I intended. Shane Hill looked at me for a long moment, and in that moment, the walls Cora had described, the ones that would need scaffolding, were thinner than usual. Or maybe I was just standing closer to them. Because I wanted you to know I was already paying attention, he said, before I knew you were a doctor, before the coffee shop. I was already? He stopped, seemed to reconsider. I thought you should know. He left, and I sat in examination room 2 for 2 minutes longer than necessary, looking at the anatomy poster before I went to see my next patient. December arrived in Harrow Creek with the kind of cold that was serious rather than merely inconvenient. The kind that came down off the hills before dawn and lay across the town like something deliberate. I kept running the East Trail because I am stubborn and because the cold in the mornings had a clarifying effect that no amount of coffee could replicate, and because, if I am being honest with myself, which I try to be in the mornings before the day's noise gets in, I had started to wonder if I might see Shane Hill. I saw him on a Friday in the second week of December. He was standing at the edge of his property, where the tree line met the trail, with a thermos in one hand and his breath making small clouds in the cold air. He was wearing a dark canvas jacket, and his dark hair was damp at the edges. And when I saw him, I felt something in my chest do a complicated thing that I decided not to examine too closely. "Morning," I said, slowing to a walk. "Doctor. Bill." I had told him this twice. He was being careful. I found that I liked it. "You're up early." "Always am." He held up the thermos in a kind of offering. "Coffee. Black. No exceptions." I laughed. It came out more genuine than I expected. "I'm good, thank you." We stood there in the cold morning at the edge of his property for a moment, and the town was quiet enough that I could hear the trees moving. "Headaches?" I asked, because I was still his doctor and this was a legitimate question. "Better. 3 times this week instead of 5. "Sleeping more?" "Trying." He looked into the tree line. "It's a work in progress." "What keeps you up, specifically?" He was quiet long enough that I thought he might not answer. "Then, I keep a list. In my head. Everyone in my pack, what they need, what they're struggling with, whether I'm doing enough. I run it before I sleep, like a checklist, and then I find something I missed or something I need to fix, and—" He made a small gesture with the hand holding the thermos. "Hours go by." I thought about what it must be like to be wired that way, to have a mind that would not stop accounting. "When's the last time someone asked you how you were doing?" I said. He looked at me. Those gray eyes in the cold morning light. "Before you just now?" He thought about it genuinely. "Can't remember." We started walking together. I don't know exactly how it happened, but we were both walking along the trail, and the cold was biting, and the pines were dark against the pale sky. And he told me about the pack, about the 12 families he was responsible for, the disputes he mediated, the teenager who wanted to go to college 4 states away and whose parents were afraid, the older woman who was losing her memory slowly and needed more support than her family admitted. He told me these things not as complaints, but as the contents of that list in his head, laid out like items on a table. And I listened, because I am good at listening and because I wanted to. At some point, the trail curved back toward town, and we stopped where it split, his direction and mine. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't usually." "Don't apologize. I meant it." I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. The cold had put color in his cheeks, and there was something in his expression that was not quite so contained as usual, like the morning had loosened something. "Same time next week?" he said. "If I happen to be running," I said, "and you happen to be standing at your tree line with your black coffee." The corner of his mouth moved into something that was, finally, unambiguously a smile. Small and a little crooked and completely genuine, and it did something to the inside of my chest that I was not remotely prepared for. "Happens every morning," he said. The something that was building between us was slow, like a river rising, So gradual you might not notice until the water was at your ankles, and then suddenly you were in the current. Every morning that December, I ran the East Trail. He was there most days, thermos in hand, and we walked the curved stretch together before the split. We talked about everything and nothing. About books. He was working through a biography of a 19th century naturalist and had opinions about the author's choices that he articulated with the precision of a man who had been thinking about them alone for too long. About the town and its history, which he knew the way you know the inside of a house you grew up in. About my life in the city, which I described more honestly to him than I had to anyone else, the accumulated fineness of it, the way I had felt like a background character in my own story. What changed? He asked one morning, and I knew he meant what made me finally leave. I got a patient, I said, 56 years old, healthy, active, good labs, came in for a routine visit, and while I was asking the standard questions, he started crying, not dramatically, just quietly, like a slow leak. He said he'd been happy once, a long time ago, and he couldn't remember exactly when he stopped, just that he had, and now he was 56 and the window was narrowing. I paused. And I sat with him for an extra 45 minutes while my next 3 patients waited, and I was late home, and I sat in my apartment and I thought, I know exactly what he means. Shane was quiet for a moment. And now? I looked at the trail ahead of us, at the pale winter sky through the pines. I think the window is wider than I thought. I felt him look at me when I said that, but I didn't turn to meet it. Not yet. The morning it changed. The morning something shifted from the slow accumulation of a river into the abruptness of a current was in the 3rd week of December. I was a little late reaching the trail, having stayed up too long reading, and when I rounded the bend where his property met the path, I expected to find him already there and already leaving. Instead, I found him crouched by the trail's edge, examining something in the dead grass. He heard my footsteps and stood, and when he turned, I saw that he had a small bird in his cupped hands, a winter wren, barely larger than his thumb, that had apparently flown into something and been stunned. He was holding it with an absurd gentleness, this big man with the capable hands, cradling this small creature that weighed nothing at all. Is it alive? I came closer. Breathing. Stunned, maybe. I didn't want to leave it. I looked at the bird, and then at his hands, and something inside me made a decision before my conscious mind caught up with it. You can set it somewhere sheltered, I said. A low branch, out of the wind. Give it time to clear its head. I was talking about the bird. He nodded, found a branch, set the wren down with the same ridiculous care, stood back. We both watched it for a moment. It blinked, ruffled its feathers once, blinked again. Good patient, I said, better than most alphas. I laughed, and he turned to look at me when I did, and I was too close, or the right distance, and the laugh was still in the air between us when he said quietly, like something he had decided to say before he lost his nerve, Bill. Just my name, but the way he said it. Shane, I said, equally quiet. He reached up and very carefully, asking in the gesture, giving me every opportunity, tucked a piece of hair behind my ear that the wind had blown across my face. His fingertips brushed my cheekbone, barely. And then his hand dropped. We looked at each other in the cold morning air. I'd been trying to figure out how to do this correctly, he said. I don't want to get it wrong. There's no wrong way to have a conversation. This isn't just a conversation. No, I agreed, it isn't. He exhaled slowly. Have dinner with me, tonight if you're free, or whenever works. Shane Hill, who had thrown a man across a parking lot without apparent effort, who ran 12-pack families in his head like a constant accounting, who held stunned wrens with extraordinary care, was nervous, asking me to dinner with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly how much it mattered to him and was afraid to show it. I found it the most endearing thing I had ever witnessed. Tonight works, I said. The smile that crossed his face was nothing like the small, contained almost smiles I had been collecting for weeks. It was wide and warm and made the gray of his eyes lighter, and I thought, oh, that's what he looks like when he lets the walls down. He cooked. I discovered this when he picked me up at 6 and drove me not to the diner or either of the restaurants in town, but to his own house, a large solid structure set back from the main road, all timber and stone warm light in the windows. I should have asked if you had preferences, he said, walking me up the path. I assumed I can take you somewhere else if… Shane. I stopped walking. He stopped too. I would like very much to have dinner in your house. He nodded, and something in his posture settled. The house was… I searched for the right word. Considered. Everything in it had been chosen with care. Books arranged not decoratively but by subject, a mix of practical and beautiful. A wood stove in the living room, actually in use. A kitchen that was clearly worked in regularly, worn at the right places, organized efficiently. It smelled like cedar and something cooking, and I stood in the doorway of the kitchen while he moved around it and felt, with a certainty that startled me, that I could get very comfortable in this room. He had made short ribs, braised low and slow, which meant he had been planning this since at least that morning. Polenta. Roasted root vegetables. Bread he had baked himself, which I discovered with a kind of disbelieving delight. You bake bread. The pack expects it. Community dinners, pack events. He set the loaf on the board. It stopped being a task and became a habit. It's beautiful. I meant the loaf, but also the idea of it, the image of him making bread for the people he was responsible for. This additional thing he did without fanfare. It's bread. But he was pleased. I could see it. We ate at the kitchen table instead of the dining room, which was his suggestion, and immediately felt right, less formal, more honest. The food was extraordinary, which I told him, and he accepted the compliment with the graceful deflection of someone who cooks because they enjoy feeding people rather than to receive praise. We talked until well past 10. About things that had not come up on the morning walks, about his parents, who had died when he was in his mid-20s and left him the pack and the land and the weight of it all at an age when most people are still figuring out who they are. About the pack members he had watched grow up, the children who were now adults, the particular grief and satisfaction of that. About his fears, and he named them, which cost him something I could tell. But he did it anyway. That he was not enough, that he missed things. That the list in his head was not actually sufficient to protect everyone he loved. I told him about my family, scattered and loving in a distracted way, about the city and the parking garage view, about why I became a doctor, not the polished answer I gave at interviews, but the real one, which was that I had grown up afraid of helplessness, and medicine had seemed like the best available argument against it. Are you still afraid of it? He said. Helplessness? Yes, I said. But I'm learning to distinguish between the helplessness I can fix and the kind I have to sit with. He was quiet for a moment, turning his wineglass slowly in his fingers. I haven't learned that yet. You will. How do you know? I looked at him across the kitchen table in the warm light, this man who carried 12 families and a bird in his hands and could not sleep for the weight of his accounting. Because you're paying attention, I said. People who pay attention learn things eventually. When I left that night, late, the town quiet, the cold absolutely clear and sharp, he walked me to my car and we stood beside it in the driveway. Neither of us moved to end the evening. His breath made small clouds. Mine made smaller ones. Same time tomorrow? He said finally. On the trail. I run every morning. I know. He looked at me steadily. I'd like this to happen again, not just the mornings. Dinner again? Yes, and other things. He said it simply, directly, the way he said everything, without embellishment. I'm interested in you, Bill. I wanted to say that clearly. I had been told similar things before, in various configurations, with varying degrees of sincerity. It had never quite sounded like this. Like a statement of fact rather than a play for something. I'm interested in you too, I said, equally directly. He nodded. And then, carefully, he leaned forward and pressed his mouth to my temple, brief and warm, and stepped back. Good night, he said. Good night, Shane. I drove home with the heater running and the radio off, and I thought about temple kisses and cedar-smelling kitchens and a man who held birds in his hands like they were important. And I thought, fine is not the same as good, and this is starting to feel like good. We did not rush. This is the thing I want to say about how it happened between us. We did not rush, and this felt deliberate on both sides. Like we each recognized that what was being built was something we did not want to build badly. January in Harrow Creek was cold enough to justify the wood stove, and Shane had a standing habit of pack dinners on Sunday evenings. He hosted them in rotation between a few pack families. But every third or fourth Sunday, it was at his house. He invited me to the first one in January with the slightly careful phrasing of a man who understood this was an escalation, but wanted to make it a choice rather than an assumption. I came. I sat at his enormous dining room table, surrounded by 12 families' worth of noise and warmth and the specific chaos of a community that had been together for generations. There were children who climbed onto Shane's chair to whisper things to him while he talked to me, and elders who spoke with the authority of decades. And a pair of teenage siblings who argued about something with the complete conviction of people who had never been wrong in their lives. It was loud and warm and slightly overwhelming. Shane, in the middle of it, was different than he was on the morning trail or across the kitchen table. Still contained, still watchful, but the containment here served a different purpose. He was the anchor point, the fixed thing that everyone else moved around, and he did it with a quiet competence that was not performance. He noticed things: the elder who needed water, the child who had gotten too tired and needed a redirect, the tension between two brothers that needed a brief, private word. He moved through these adjustments without interruption, without drawing attention to them. He also, across the table and through all of it, kept track of me. Not possessively. I was not someone who needed possessing, and he seemed to understand that, but attentively. Making sure I was not drowning, catching my eye occasionally in a way that said, "Are you okay? Do you need anything? I see you." I was okay. I did not need anything. But I found that his seeing me was something I wanted anyway. Afterward, when the last family had gone home and the dishes were done, he had tried to do them alone, and I had declined to let him. We sat by the wood stove with tea and the particular pleasant exhaustion of a good evening. "Your pack loves you," I said. "They love the dinners." "Shane?" He looked at me. "They love you." I set down my tea. "The way they look at you. It's not just duty. They actually love you." He was quiet for a moment, and something moved through his expression that he did not quite manage to school down in time. Something that looked like it was trying very hard not to be moved. "I know," he said finally, low. "I just don't know what to do with it sometimes." "You don't have to do anything with it. You can just let it be true." He looked at me for a long time. The fire made soft sounds. The house was quiet in the way houses are after they have been full of people and warmth. "You're good at this," he said. "At what?" "Saying the thing that makes everything simpler." I shook my head. "I just say what I see." "That's the skill." He reached over and took my hand, and this time it was not the brief, careful gesture of asking permission. It was the gesture of someone who had decided to be here, in this chair, with this person, holding this hand, without qualification. "What do you see right now?" I looked at him. The firelight. The face I had been memorizing without meaning to for 2 months. "A man I want to keep knowing," I said. His hand tightened slightly on mine. "Same," he said. We sat by the wood stove until very late, and for the first time in as long as I could accurately remember, I did not think once about eggs or omelet or whether my life was someone else's. By March, the trails were thawing, and the mornings were lighter, and something between Shane and me had settled into a shape that felt less like becoming and more like being. We had found a rhythm: mornings on the trail, dinners at his house or mine, pack events on Sundays. He had started sleeping more. I knew because he mentioned it once, briefly, with a slightly wondering tone, like he had not expected the advice to actually work. The headaches had diminished to once a week, then once a month. He had also, somewhere in February, stopped being quite so careful about the walls. Not that they disappeared. They were structural, the walls of someone who had needed them for a long time and had built them well. But they were more permeable now. He let me see the worry more readily, the moments of doubt, the exhaustion that came with being the fixed point for everyone else. And in return, I found myself being honest with him about things I usually managed alone. The difficult cases at the clinic, the ones that stayed with me. The patient I had lost in February who had been young and should not have been sick, the weight of that. We held each other's harder things. This was new territory for me. I had been, for most of my adult life, efficient at solitude. Not lonely exactly, but self-contained. The city had made this easier. Everyone in the city was their own project. Shane was the first person in years who had made me feel that my harder things were not a burden to share, but a reason to be present. In late March, he kissed me properly for the first time. We were in his kitchen. I had brought groceries, a habit I had developed that he pretended to resist and clearly enjoyed. And I was looking for a bowl in the cabinet above the stove, and he came to reach it for me because he was taller and it was faster, and when he handed it down, he was very close. And then we were both just there close in the kitchen that smelled like cedar and the garlic I had already put on the pan. He looked at me. I looked at him. "I'd like to kiss you," he said. Same directness, same care. "Shane," I said. "Yes." So he did. And it was like everything else about him, deliberate, unhurried, genuine, paying attention. His hand came up to cup the side of my face, and he kissed me like it mattered. Like I was someone worth kissing carefully. The garlic burned slightly. Neither of us cared. April came with a kind of warmth that felt earned after winter, and I was happy. This is not a complicated statement, but it is a significant one. I was happy in the specific, anchored way of someone who has stopped performing their life and started living it. The house that had been just dead leaves and hope now had a garden I was attempting, and I ran the East Trail every morning, and Shane was there most of them. And on the Sundays that were not packed dinners, he came to my house instead, and we made dinner together badly and well in turns. And the general texture of my days had changed in a way I would have found difficult to explain to my earlier self. I was happy, and I was, without having precisely planned it, falling in love with Shane Hill. I did not say this to him in April. I thought it at a Sunday dinner in late April while he was laughing at something one of the pack children had said, a real laugh, his head tipped back slightly, and I thought, I love this man. It settled into me with the calm certainty of something that has been true for a while and is only now being recognized. Not terrifying, not earth-moving, just, yes, this is the true thing. I was also, in April, experiencing some things that I was as a medical professional. Attempting to reason through with the specific difficulty of a person who does not want to examine something too closely because they are afraid of what they will find. My omega cycles had always been irregular, medically managed, predictable within a range, not something I had ever needed to think about much because I had not been in a relationship that made it relevant. But in the first week of April, I found myself with heightened sensitivity to smell, which was not unusual, but Shane's cedar and leather scent had become almost vertiginous, which was notable. I was tired in a way that 12 hours of sleep did not fully fix. I was nauseous in the mornings, which I had attributed to running too hard on an empty stomach. On the morning of April the 14th, I sat in my bathroom before my run and counted days on the calendar on my phone and then sat very still for approximately 2 minutes. Then I drove to the clinic early, before Marcus arrived, and ran a panel on myself in the lab with the specific efficient calm of someone who is not calm at all. I sat with the results for a long time. Then I called Shane. "Are you busy this morning?" My voice sounded remarkably even. "I can be free. What do you need?" He heard something in my voice despite the evenness. He always heard things. "I'd like you to come to the clinic. Not as a patient, as someone I need to talk to." Silence. "Bill. Are you okay?" "Yes." A pause. "I think so. I need to show you something." He arrived in 20 minutes, which meant he had been moving before we hung up. He came through the clinic door in his flannel shirt and his old boots, and when he found me in examination room 2, where I had been sitting not thinking very carefully about anything at all, The look on his face was the same one I had caught in the parking lot that first evening, the one behind the composed exterior. Open. Trying to prepare itself, without knowing for what. I handed him the printed lab results without preamble, because Shane was someone who preferred directness, and I needed his hands to be doing something so that mine could stop shaking. He read them. I watched his face. He read them again. Then he put the paper down very carefully on the examination table, and he looked at me, and his expression was something I had not seen on him before. Not contained, not composed. Something broken open and wide and looking at me across the space between us with everything in it. "You're pregnant," he said. "Yes." The word between us, in the examination room in the morning quiet of the clinic, with my yes. He put his hand over his mouth, took it away, looked at the lab results again, looked at me, Bill, Shane. "How long have you?" "I found out this morning." I ran the panel myself. I was watching his face the way I watched patients' faces when I delivered significant news, looking for the thing underneath the first reaction. "I know we haven't talked about any of this. I understand if—" "Stop," he said it gently, but with absolute firmness. "Don't tell me what I'm allowed to feel or not feel. Give me a moment." I stopped, gave him the moment. He stood up from where he had been leaning against the examination table, ran a hand through his hair, walked to the window, which looked out on the parking lot where I had first seen him, which felt like something, and stood there with his back to me for a moment, his shoulders moving with a slow breath. Then he turned around and his face was resolved, clear in a way that was its own kind of answer. "I want this," he said. "If you do, I want." He stopped, started again. "I want to be here for this, for you, all of it. Whatever that means, whatever shape it takes, I want to figure it out with you." He looked at me steadily. "Do you want this?" I had been so focused on the fact of it, the lab results, the calling him, the carefully managed not thinking. I had not actually let myself arrive at the answer to that question. I arrived at it now. "Yes," I said. Quiet and certain. Something in him broke open further and settled, simultaneously, like a wave cresting and finding land. He crossed the examination room in 3 strides and pulled me in, not gently this time, not carefully, but with the full force of someone who was not holding anything back. And I put my arms around him and pressed my face into his neck and felt his heart going at the pace of something that had been frightened and was starting to not be. We stood like that for a while in examination room 2. Then I had an 8 o'clock patient, and he had a PAC meeting at 9, and the day had to continue. "But first, come for dinner tonight," he said against my hair. "I'm the one who should be feeding you. You're the one who went pale." I didn't go pale. Shane. I went slightly less tanned. I laughed into his shirt. He held on a few seconds longer. We had the first ultrasound at 7 weeks. I had scheduled it with Dr. Carr. Okafor, because being your own prenatal physician was not something I was willing to attempt, and because Kezia Okafor was the best doctor in the clinic and also happened to be impossible to rattle, which I had a feeling was going to be useful. Shane had taken the morning off. He sat in the chair beside the examination table with the quality of stillness he sometimes had, not at rest, but coiled in a way that looked like rest, and he had brought coffee for himself and peppermint tea for me because the coffee smell had been difficult lately, and he had learned this without being told. He had been learning everything I needed lately without being told. It was slightly amazing. Kezia was calm and professional and friendly in the way that good doctors are, which is to say, genuinely interested in her patients without being invested in her own reaction to them. She asked her questions, made her notes, picked up the ultrasound wand. "This will be cold," she said, which every sonographer says and which does not make it less true. Shane watched the screen with a focused attention that was specifically his. He had his elbows on his knees, the coffee cup forgotten in one hand. I watched his face more than the screen. Sound first, the steady, rapid pulse of a heartbeat that filled the small room. Shane's breath caught. I looked at the screen, the small bean-shaped presence, the flickering movement. "Everything looks good," Kezia said, moving the wand, checking measurements. Strong heartbeat. Good placement. Let me just. She moved the wand slightly, a small adjustment. And then her expression changed. Not alarmed, not concerned, but carefully attentive in a specific way I recognized from my own clinical practice as the expression of a professional who has just found something significant. "Okay," she said, in the tone that meant, "I need a moment." Shane straightened very slightly. He had heard it too. "So," Kezia said, in the careful, bright voice of someone managing her own reaction to something surprising, "I want to show you both something." She turned the screen slightly toward us, and she pointed. "That," she said, "is heartbeat 1. The flickering, the pulse. And that," she moved her finger slightly, "is heartbeat 2. Shane's coffee cup hit the floor. Not thrown, not dropped in a dramatic gesture. It simply left his hand as the information reached his brain, and the circuit between his hand and his intention briefly disconnected. The cup bounced once. Plastic lid, fortunately, and came to rest by the leg of the examination table, coffee spreading across the tile in a patient, unstoppable way. None of us moved for about 3 seconds. Then Kezia said serenely, because she was an excellent doctor, "Congratulations, you're having twins." I looked at Shane. Shane was looking at the screen. His face had moved through something very quickly. Shock. The territory. Past shock. And then something that was working its way toward an expression I did not yet have a word for. Something that involved the particular brightness people get in their eyes when they are feeling something too large for their face to fully contain. "Shane," I said softly. He looked at me, and the expression resolved, finally, into something clear and unmistakable. Something I had never seen on his face before, and would spend the rest of my life being glad I was there to witness the first time. Pure, unguarded joy. 2, he said, like he was learning the word. 2, Kezia confirmed pleasantly, and began doing measurements. He picked up the coffee cup from the floor, automatically, and set it on the counter. His hands were not quite steady. Then he reached over and took my hand, both hands around mine, and held on. 2, he said again, to the screen, to the room, to the fact of it. "I know," I said. "That's..." He stopped. His jaw moved. "That's 2 separate people." "Medically speaking, yes." He looked at me, and his eyes were bright in a way that I pretended not to notice because he would find it embarrassing later, and I loved him for it. "Are you okay?" he managed. "I found out at 7 weeks that I'm having twins," I said. "I'm somewhere between fine and terrified, and I haven't decided which yet." "Both," he said. "We can be both." "That's very reasonable of you." I dropped my coffee. "You did." "I've never..." He stopped, shook his head slightly. "I don't drop things. First time for everything." Kezia was printing images with the tactful efficiency of a professional who understood when a moment needed to happen around her. She handed them over, small black and white printouts, 2 small presences side by side, and Shane took them in his free hand, the others still holding mine, and looked at them for a long time. "Can I?" His voice was different, lower, something in it I had not heard before. "Can I come to all of these? Every appointment?" "Yes," I said. "I was going to ask you to." "Good." He looked back at the images. "Good." What followed was not a fairy tale in the traditional sense, because fairy tales skip the middle parts, and the middle parts, the utterly ordinary, extraordinary middle, were what made everything real. There was the evening I was too tired to cook and too proud to say so, and Shane arrived with food from the diner, the biscuits specifically which he had learned I craved, without me having asked, because he had simply noticed. There was the morning in week 10 when the nausea was bad enough that I sat on the bathroom floor and he sat there with me, not making it a thing, just present, reading pack emails on his phone while I breathed through it. There was the Tuesday in May when the 2 pack teenagers, the arguing ones, came to the clinic for an appointment and spent 20 minutes asking me careful, slightly awkward questions about whether I was going to be okay, whether the babies were going to be all right, whether Dr. Shane, which was not his title, but they used it with complete conviction, was going to be around more. They were trying, in the completely transparent way of teenagers, to express that they were invested. I told them everyone was going to be fine and sent them home with the vitamin samples I had been meaning to give their family. And then sat in my office for 5 minutes, being moved by the specific kind of love that a pack has, which is not clean or organized, but is very thorough. Shane told the pack formally in May. He called the dinner, the whole group, and he stood at the head of his dining room table and said, "Bill and I are having children, 2 of them. In November. I wanted you all to know because they're going to be part of this family." The response was immediate and loud and warm. One of the older women started crying and had to be gently handed a napkin. The teenagers cheered and then acted like they had not cheered. One of the smallest children asked if the babies could share her room, which was not logistically the question that needed addressing, but was very sincere. I stood in the middle of it, and Omega, who had moved here 18 months ago to an experiment, and felt the walls of my own solitude come down in a way that did not feel like loss. The conversation about living arrangements happened in June, on a Sunday morning when we were in his kitchen, my second home by now, and I was making the tea and he was making the eggs and the radio was on low, which was our version of peaceful. "I've been thinking," he said in the tone that meant he had been thinking about this for a while. "Yes," I said, "this house." He gestured, encompassing it. "It's large. It's close to your trail. It's pack territory, which matters for what comes next." A pause. "I'd like you to live here, with me." Another pause. "I'd like to ask you that." I turned around from the kettle. He was looking at the eggs in the pan, giving them unnecessary attention. "Shane." He looked up. "I was wondering when you were going to ask," I said. Something relaxed in his jaw. I didn't want to assume. "You've been running extra firewood to my house every week since March. It's cold in the mornings. It's June. Mornings are deceptive." I crossed the kitchen and put my arms around him from behind, my chin on his shoulder, watching the eggs. He covered my hands with his, easy and warm. "Yes," I said. "I'll live here, with you." He turned the eggs. "Okay? That's all? Okay?" "I'm gonna be very pleased about this for a long time," he said. "I just prefer to be pleased quietly." "I know," I said. "I love that about you." He went still. Just for a moment. Then he turned around, eggs forgotten, and looked at me with that open, careful expression, the walls completely down. "Say that again," he said. "I love that about you." "No. He stopped. Before that. I looked up at him. This man who had stopped a fight in a parking lot with the force of his presence and could not sleep for worrying about his pack, and had dropped his coffee cup at the best possible news, and held a stunned bird in his hands like it was important. "I love you," I said, clear and simple, the way he always said the things that mattered. He pulled me in and held on for a long time, and the eggs burned, and neither of us cared even slightly. "I love you," he said into my hair. "I have been for a while. I couldn't," he exhaled. I wanted to be sure I was saying it at the right time. "When did you decide this was it?" "When you sat on your bathroom floor in week 10 and didn't ask me to leave," he said, and I realized I didn't want to be anywhere else. They were born in November, on a morning that was cold and clear, the kind that follows the first real frost of the year. Shane had driven through the dark at 3 in the morning with a speed and composure that would have impressed me more if I had not been somewhat occupied. And he had been with me every minute of the hours that followed, which were long, and then suddenly not, and then there were 2. Asha first, with a voice that suggested she had opinions about being here and wanted them registered immediately. Then Eli, quieter, who opened his eyes within seconds and appeared to be taking stock of the situation with what I can only describe as an evaluative look that I recognized. Shane held Asha first because she was placed in his arms before he was prepared, and he was simply, suddenly holding a person very small with dark hair and gray eyes, already impossibly. His eyes and his face did the thing it had done in the ultrasound room, broke open, resolved into something too full for its usual containment. "Hi," he said to her, very quietly. "I'm going to take good care of you." She scrunched her face in a way that could have meant anything, and probably meant nothing but which I chose to interpret as acknowledgement. Then Eli. Smaller, calmer, looking at Shane with that evaluative patience. Shane looked back with the same attention he gave everything that mattered to him. "Hi," he said. "You too, both of you, I promise." They wheeled a cot in for him, and he refused to use it. He sat in the chair beside my bed with Asha in the crook of one arm and Eli in the other. And he sat very still with this enormous, careful attention, the way he had once held a small, stunned bird. I watched him from the bed, exhausted in a way that was also the deepest satisfaction I had ever known. "You dropped your coffee," I said. He looked up at me, startled for a moment, and then he understood. The ultrasound room. The floor. The beginning. His smile was the wide, warm, genuine one. The best decision my hands ever made. Very philosophical. "I'm holding two people," he said. "I'm allowed to be philosophical." I closed my eyes. Outside the window, the November morning was getting lighter. Inside the room, the warmth of 3 other heartbeats was the most real thing I had ever been near. "Shane," I said, not opening my eyes. "Bill, thank you for being on your property that morning." A pause. "Thank you for running on my trail. Technically, it's public land. Don't push it." I smiled, eyes still closed. From across the room, I heard him shift slightly, very carefully, rearranging the weight of the 2 small people in his arms. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'm not sleeping, I'm resting." "You're sleeping." "I'm just closing my eyes." I was asleep in 3 minutes." He sat in the chair and watched the morning come through the window and made the list he always made. Who needed what? What needed doing? Who needed watching over? And, for the first time in as long as he could remember, the list felt like abundance rather than burden. The following April, when Asha and Eli were 5 months old and increasingly interested in the world and each other, I ran the East Trail for the first time since before they were born. I had missed it. The specific cold of the early morning, the smell of pine, the way the world looked before it had put on all its noise. Shane was at the tree line. He was holding 2 carriers, the kind that attached to your chest, and Asha was in one and Eli was in the other because he had decided, with the particular Shane Hill logic that was impossible to argue with and usually correct, that the twins should not miss their first spring morning on the trail. I stopped when I saw him. Asha was looking at the trees with an expression of intense scholarly concentration. Eli was asleep. "You're taking them on the trail," I said. "They're already on the trail." He held out the thermos. Coffee. Black, no exceptions. I was going to run. Run? Slow. We'll keep up. I looked at the 3 of them. This man and these 2 small people he was carrying, with the extraordinary care he brought to everything that mattered to him, and the thing in my chest that had been doing complicated things since a parking lot on a cool September evening settled, finally, into a shape I could name. Home. This was home. "You're sure?" I said. "The trail is uneven in places. I've been walking this trail my entire life. You've been walking it without 2 infants attached to your chest. First time for everything," he said. Gray eyes, morning light, the smile that was still capable of undoing me. I took the thermos, took a sip, made a face. "Black," I said. "No exceptions. Shane." "Bill." I handed it back. He took it. We started walking, the 2 of us and the 2 of them, on the East Trail in the April morning, with the town waking up below us and the pines green above us, and the specific warmth of a year that had turned out to be something far larger and truer than the experiment I had arrived in Harrow Creek to run. Asha made a sound at a bird in the branches. "That's a wren," Shane told her with complete seriousness. She regarded the branch, made the sound again. "She's skeptical," I said. "She'll come around." He glanced at me sideways. "They both will, about most things." I looked at him. "They're going to be brilliant," he said, simple and certain, the way he always said the things he meant most. "Both of them. And stubborn. And careful." He paused. "Like their father." "Which one?" He looked at me, and his face in the morning light was the face of a man with no walls up, which was still something I was learning to receive and intended to spend a long time learning more about. "Both," he said. We walked on through the spring morning, the four of us, and the trail was uneven in places, and we were very slow, and it was the best walk I'd ever taken. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon, link is in the description. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.